The wind tore across the barren plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant pine. In the small town of Red Rock Hollow, whispers of his name filled every saloon, every dusty street, every broken fence. They called him a monster, a shadow that no one dared approach, a man whose past was as dark as the scars etched across his hands and face. Children would peek from behind shuttered windows when he rode past, clutching their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with fear. Men would avert their gaze, pretending the rough leather of their boots and the weight of their rifles made them safer. But he did not ride to scare them. He rode to disappear, to keep the ghosts that chased him at bay. His name was Cale Thorne, and in every whispered warning there was a hint of truth and a lot of lies. Cale's world had been built on the edges of fear. A man who had known too much pain, too much loss, he had learned that the world could not be trusted. And yet there was a quiet honor in him that no one seemed willing to notice. Even in Red Rock Hollow, a place that feared the shadows, there was a heartbeat beneath the rumors. He moved like a storm ready to break, silent but powerful, eyes like cold iron that missed nothing. Every step he took left a mark. Every gesture hinted at strength and sorrow in equal measure. The sun had just begun to fall, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, when she appeared. Leora Vale, the daughter of the town's oldest rancher, carried herself like the wind itself, fierce, unbroken, and impossible to ignore. Her eyes were a storm of green and gold, sharp with curiosity, unafraid even when the townsfolk whispered Cale's name. She had heard the stories like everyone else, but there was something about him that called to her, mystery that refused to be buried under rumor and fear. That evening, the town was quieter than usual. The saloon doors creaked on their hinges as the last of the sun's light slipped away. Lanterns flickered in the windows, casting trembling shadows across the dirt streets. Cale rode in, dust trailing behind his worn boots, and the horse that seemed almost as untamed as he was. He did not wave or nod to anyone. He never did. His reputation preceded him, and any attempt at pleasantries felt unnecessary. But Leora's gaze followed him, steady and unshaken, as if she were searching for something the rest of the town refused to see. It started with a single act of courage, or perhaps instinct. A gang of drifters, troublemakers, who had been testing the edges of Red Rock Hollow's patience, decided that Leora's family ranch would be an easy target. They did not know Cale Thorne. They did not know that beneath the fearsome exterior, beneath the monster label that clung to him like a shadow, there was a heart capable of fierce loyalty. By the time the drifters had reached the outskirts of the ranch, Cale was already there. The wind carried the sound of his horse's hooves before anyone could see him, and by the time the gang turned, they were met with eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated. Cale did not speak. He never did unless it was necessary. But his presence alone was enough to shift the balance of fear. The gang faltered, laughed nervously, unsure whether they faced a man or a legend. Leora watched from the porch, heart pounding. She had never believed the stories until now. The man everyone called a monster moved with a precision that was terrifying in its calm. His hands were steady, his gaze unflinching, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. As the night deepened, the wind carried more than dust. It carried the tension of unspoken histories, of secrets buried beneath years of pain. Cale's mind wandered, but only briefly. He remembered a time when protection had meant failure, when saving someone had brought more sorrow than relief. And yet as he stood there, facing men who thought cruelty was strength, he felt the pull of something stronger than fear, something that had been dormant for years. The instinct to protect, to stand unwavering in the face of danger, flared within him like wildfire. Leora's father emerged from the shadows, rifle in hand, but it was clear he had no intention of confronting the gang. He had heard the whispers, too. He had seen the scars, the lonely rides, the quiet reputation that clung to Cale like a second skin. And yet, when the first stone was thrown, when the first shot rang out, Cale moved. Swift, precise, and silent, he intercepted the threat. No words were exchanged. There was no speech, no heroics in the way stories told, just action and the undeniable proof of a heart that could choose right when the world expected darkness. The drifters scattered, not from the gun, but from the certainty in Cale's eyes. And in that moment, the legend shifted. Leora stepped closer, her boots crunching on the dry earth, feeling a courage that matched his own. She did not speak, but her presence was acknowledgement enough. She understood what the town refused to see. The monster they feared was not what he seemed. There was strength in him, yes, but also something far more honor, loyalty, and the unyielding will to protect the innocent. Yet even as the last echoes of confrontation faded, a shadow remained. The town's whispers would not vanish overnight.
How?
Even Leora could sense it, the tension in the air, the eyes that followed every movement, the unspoken question that lingered like a storm cloud. What had he done before? And what was he truly capable of? Cale did not wait for answers. He turned his horse, the leather creaking under the weight of a man who carried more than just a name. Leora watched him go, a mix of relief and curiosity twisting inside her. There was a pull she could not explain, a need to understand the man who had changed the course of that night. But Cale Thorne moved like the wind itself, unpredictable, leaving only a trail of dust and questions in his wake. As the stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Red Rock Hollow seemed smaller, quieter, yet heavier with anticipation. The town had seen a glimpse of truth, a crack in the facade of fear that had dominated their lives. But the story was far from over. Cale's past would not remain hidden forever. The choices he made, the shadows he carried, and the heart he had revealed would collide in ways no one could foresee. And Leora, standing on the edge of a world she had always known, realized that the man they called a monster might just change everything, not through words, but through the courage of a single, decisive act. The wind blew harder now, carrying whispers from every corner of the town. Cale's figure was already fading into the night, a silhouette against the horizon. But the tension remained thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm. Something was coming, something that would test loyalty, strength, and the fragile line between fear and trust. Leora clenched her fists, heart pounding. She knew the night had only just begun, and that the world had yet to see the depth of Cale Thorne's heart. And in the stillness that followed, the question lingered. Impossible to shake. Could the man they had called a monster truly be the hero they never expected? Cale rode deep into the canyons beyond Red Rock Hollow, where the land stretched wide and unforgiving, the jagged rocks casting shadows that blended with his own. The wind carried a chill now, sharper than the day's heat, and the silence around him was a kind of sanctuary. Out here, no whispers followed, no fearful eyes watched. Out here he could remember without interruption. He let the horse slow, each hoof striking the dirt with deliberate rhythm, letting the memories rise like smoke in the cold air. He had not always been feared, not always called a monster. Once, he had a name spoken with respect, even warmth, though those days felt like another life entirely. Cale Thorne had been a man shaped by loyalty and loss, a man who had fought not for fear but for survival, and who had learned far too early that the world often punished the good and rewarded the ruthless. He remembered his home, a small settlement miles to the north, where the rivers were clean and the trees whispered over a quiet valley. His family had been simple folk, proud but humble, until a raid changed everything. The memory of that night haunted him still, the fire swallowing the timber walls, the screams of those he loved, the helplessness that had set his chest on fire. From that night forward, Cale learned that mercy was fragile, and that survival often required the hard hand of power. He had wandered west after that, taking the trails few dared to travel, earning his reputation in the shadows. Tales of his strength, his silence, and the scars he bore spread faster than he wanted. By the time he reached Red Rock Hollow, the stories had preceded him. People called him a monster, whispered about the things he might have done, and assumed the darkness in his eyes was born of cruelty rather than pain. It had been easier to let them believe the lies than to try explaining truths they were not ready to hear. Even now, Cale felt the weight of that perception pressing down on him. He had saved Leora without a word, and yet he knew the town would not see it as an act of heroism. They would whisper, speculate, and perhaps someday tell stories of fear instead of the truth. But he did not act for recognition. He acted because instinct demanded it. Because the sight of hers, small but unyielding against danger, had awakened something inside him that he thought had long been buried. As the canyon walls closed around him, he allowed himself a rare thought. What if she followed him? Leora Vale was unlike anyone he had met before. Fearless, unshaken, with a curiosity that mirrored his own in its intensity. He knew that if she came after him, It would bring trouble not only to herself, but to the fragile balance he had built. Cale Thorne had survived by keeping distance, by trusting no one, by allowing no attachments. And yet part of him wanted her to understand, wanted her to see what lay beneath the scars and the legend. He shook his head, feeling the old habit of solitude settle in his shoulders like armor. The canyon led him to a hidden ravine, a place few would dare enter. Here, Cale had made his refuge over the years, carving a life from the harsh rock and the sparse water that ran in secret streams. He dismounted, running a hand over the worn leather of his saddle before leading the horse to a small shelter he had built against the stone. Inside, the shadows gathered in corners, and the smell of pine and dust hung in the air. He sat quietly, letting the silence press against his thoughts. The fire he lit was small, but it threw enough light to chase the darkness from his face. Cale thought of the drifters, of the fear in their eyes, and of the ripple his presence had caused in Red Rock Hollow. They did not know him. No one did. He had learned long ago that the world was not kind to men who carried both strength and conscience in equal measure. In the settlements he had passed, mercy had often been mistaken for weakness, and loyalty had been exploited as a weapon against him. That was why he had learned to move like a shadow, to speak when necessary but act with precision when words would fail. A sudden sound made him stiffen, a rustle from the canyon entrance, light but deliberate. Cale's hand hovered over the hilt of his knife. The canyon had its dangers, wild animals, rival outlaws, and even the hidden enemies he could not see, but the movement felt different, human. He did not rise immediately. Instead he watched, letting the firelight paint the rocks, letting the night sound tell him what it could. The presence was cautious, almost hesitant, and Cale recognized that kind of approach, someone who did not want to be noticed but had no choice in stepping into the path of danger. The figure stepped into the light finally, and Cale saw her clearly. It was Leora, her green eyes bright in the fire's glow, face streaked with dust from the long ride. She did not speak, only stood, shoulders squared as if daring him to stop her. "I had to find you," she said at last, her voice steady, carrying a mix of determination and respect. "I needed to know the truth. It's about you." Cale's jaw tightened, but he did not rise. He had warned himself against attachments, against curiosity that could unravel his careful solitude. "The truth is nothing like what people say," he finally said, low and deliberate. "But it is dangerous, Leora. If you want to know, you will have to be ready for what it takes to survive it." She did not flinch. If anything, her expression sharpened. "I can take it," she replied. "I'm not afraid of the truth. I want to understand why you protect people when no one else will." There was a long pause, the kind that stretched across the canyon walls like the wind itself. Cale studied her, weighing her courage against the risk of revealing too much. He knew that opening the door to his past meant bringing more than just understanding. It meant inviting the world's dangers to her doorstep. And yet there was a part of him, buried under years of silence and isolation, that longed for someone to see him as he truly was, beyond the stories, beyond the scars. Finally, he motioned for her to sit by the fire. She obeyed, keeping her distance, but close enough to feel the heat against the chill of the night. "I was not always this shadow," he began, voice steady, but tinged with the weight of memory. "There was a time when I had a family, a place that felt like home, but it was destroyed. My father, my sister, they were taken from me, and I could not save them. After that night, I learned that mercy could be a curse, that kindness could be twisted into pain. So I left, wandering west, surviving in the shadows, doing what was necessary to stay alive." Leora listened quietly, absorbing every word. She did not interrupt, did not question, only let the firelight illuminate his face, as if trying to read every scar and every line of sorrow. "In the town," she asked softly, "they call you a monster because they don't understand?" Cale let out a bitter laugh, rough and low. "They fear what they do not understand. Fear the scars, the silence, the things I've done to survive, see power and assume cruelty. But the truth, the truth is far more complicated than stories can capture." The wind howled again, rattling the rocks around them, and Cale's mind shifted from memory to the present. Danger was never far, not in these lands. Red Rock Hollow had its own shadows, and even the small victories of the night could bring larger threats. Cale knew that protecting Leora was only the beginning. Someone or something was already watching, and the peace of their brief encounter hung by a thread. "I need to know," she said, her voice firmer now. "If the world sees you as a monster, will it ever matter what you do? Or will they only see what they want to see?" Cale's eyes narrowed. He did not have an answer for her, only a warning. The past has a way of following you, no matter how far you run, and the future. The future has its own storms, storms that neither of them could yet predict. We could see it in the stars, in the movement of the night, in the way the shadows gathered at the edges of the firelight. There were eyes upon them, waiting, calculating. And when the right moment came, the truth, no matter how brave or noble, would be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. Leora sensed it too. The silence stretched, heavy and tense, a quiet before the storm that neither could see. She had come seeking answers, seeking to understand the man behind the legend. But the canyon and the night whispered of more than just history. There were threats still in motion, secrets still buried, and a past that would not remain silent. Cale looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes like distant lightning. He had chosen to protect her once, and he would do so again, no matter the cost. But he also knew the world was waiting to test him, to judge him not by the courage he had shown, but by the fears and assumptions that clung to his name. The night was young, and the dangers of Red Rock Hollow were only beginning to stir. The wind swept through the canyon, carrying the faintest sounds of movement beyond the rocks. And Cale's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his knife. Leora shifted closer, sensing the tension, and for a moment the world held its breath. The legend, the truth, the shadows, all of it, hung in balance, waiting for the first sign of what was to come. And in that stillness, one thing was certain. The man they called a monster had a heart that could not be measured by whispers or fear. But whether the world was ready to see it remained a question with no answer yet. The night deepened, swallowing the canyon in shadows that seemed almost alive. Cale Thorne kept his eyes on the ridge above, senses stretched, listening to every creak of the rocks, every whisper of the wind. The land itself had taught him caution. The quiet moments before danger usually louder than the attack itself. He had learned to read the unseen, to feel the tremors of a threat before it arrived. And tonight, something unsettled moved through the darkness, something deliberate. Leora sat by the fire, the warmth brushing against her face. But her green eyes scanned the canyon with a sharp intensity. She had been raised on her father's ranch, surrounded by open fields and the steady rhythm of livestock. Yet this place, this hidden refuge carved from stone, felt alive in a way she had never experienced. Danger hovered like a living thing, and she could feel it pressing against her chest. She wanted answers, but she also wanted survival, and she had learned quickly that curiosity in the wrong place could be fatal. Cale spoke first, low and deliberate, not turning from the ridge. "They are close, not the drifters from town. Someone else. Someone who knows the score." He did not elaborate. Years of survival had taught him that words could carry danger just as easily as weapons. Leora did not ask who, but she noted the tension in his jaw, the way his hand lingered near the knife, and the way the horse shifted nervously beside the fire. There was a storm coming, and it would not wait for explanations. Meanwhile, in Red Rock Hollow, rumors began to stir, as they always did. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the horizon where Cale had disappeared. There were those who felt awe at his courage, but more of them felt unease. The sheriff, a stern man named Gideon Crow, had observed Cale from a distance, studying him like a puzzle that refused to be solved. He did not trust men who carried both strength and silence. His instincts told him that Cale Thorne would be a problem eventually, yet even he could not deny the truth of the night's events. Leora's family was safe because of him, and for a few fleeting hours, the town had glimpsed something beyond the monster legend. Back in the canyon, Cale's mind shifted between the present and memory. He thought of the path that had brought him here, of the losses that had shaped his hands and hardened his heart. He had faced outlaws, marauders, and men who had no conscience. He had seen betrayal in the eyes of friends and strangers alike, and still he had chosen to protect, time and again, even when no one asked him to. Now, with Leora at his side, the stakes had shifted. Protecting someone from the town was one thing. Protecting someone who sought him out was another entirely. A rustle in the shadows broke his thoughts, sharper this time, deliberate, close enough that Cale tensed fully. "Show yourself," he commanded, voice low and controlled. The wind shifted, and for a heartbeat the darkness seemed to respond. From behind a cluster of boulders, a figure emerged, man tall, lean, with eyes that glinted in the firelight. His name was Rylan Cade, a bounty hunter known across the territories for tracking the men and women others had abandoned or wanted dead. He carried no insignia, no law, only his reputation and the sense of finality he brought with every pursuit. Cale's grip tightened on the knife. Rylan had been tracking him for weeks, ever since rumors of the monster protector reached ears that had their own reasons for finding him. "You've been busy," Cale said, voice even, though his eyes never left Rylan's. "I've been looking," Rylan replied, smile cold and thin. "Looking for a man who carries stories and shadows in equal measure. And I found you, Thorn. Now the question is, who do you serve?" Cale did not answer immediately. Leora rose slowly, placing herself slightly in front of the fire, though still behind Cale. "He doesn't serve anyone but what is right," she said, voice clear. "And if you're here to threaten him or us, you should leave now." Rylan laughed, the sound dry and sharp. "Brave girl. But bravery without caution is just foolishness. You think you understand him, yet you have no idea what he is capable of or what he has survived. You think you can step into his world and not be burned by it." The tension thickened, the canyon alive with the quiet hum of threat. Cale studied Rylan, weighing the man's moves, his stance, his intentions. This was not a simple bounty hunter looking for coin. Rylan carried motives rooted in vengeance and old grudges, and Cale knew he could not allow Leora to be caught in the crossfire. The firelight flickered across the canyon walls, painting shadows that danced like ghosts, and in that movement Cale saw the possibilities. A fight, a chase, perhaps an outcome that neither of them could control. Leora shifted again, unease mixing with determination. "Why are you after him?" she asked, voice steady but wary. Rylan's eyes narrowed. "Some men leave a trail that cannot be erased. Thorn's path is full of blood and survival, and someone always comes looking for the truth. I'm not the only one." Cale's mind sharpened. Others were on the way. Allies or enemies he could not yet tell. The town, the lands beyond Red Rock Hollow, all of it seemed suddenly closer, pressing on him. He had lived through threats before, but never with someone at his side who believed in him, despite the whispers, despite the labels. And yet that belief was also a vulnerability, one that he could not afford to ignore. The wind carried distant voices now, faint but unmistakable. Cale's senses flared, and he could see movement along the canyon's edge. More figures emerged, shadows against the horizon. A gang of men, rough and trained, their eyes set with purpose. They had heard the whispers too, and they came to test the monster for themselves. Cale's instincts had never been wrong, and he could feel the gathering storm before it struck. Leora stepped closer, placing a hand on the saddle for balance. "What do we do?" she asked, voice quiet but resolute. Cale looked at her, the firelight reflecting in eyes that had known too much pain to hesitate. "We survive," he said simply, "and we make them regret ever coming." The first figure lunged from the shadows, knife glinting in the firelight, and Cale reacted instantly, intercepting with a motion honed by years of survival. The clash was quiet at first, measured, but it drew the attention of the others. Chaos began to ripple through the canyon, and Cale moved like a force of nature, precise, controlled, unyielding. Leora watched, understanding in a way she never could have in town. The monster they feared was nothing compared to the man he had become, tempered by loss and defined by loyalty. But even as Cale fought, the tension of the night shifted. Rylan watched with calculated patience, his motives hidden beneath a mask of observation. He did not intervene yet, but every movement, every glance carried a threat that lingered like poison in the air. Cale knew that defeating the immediate danger was only the beginning. The greater challenge was unraveling the web that had been cast around him for weeks, perhaps months. And in the shadows beyond the firelight, other eyes followed, unknown observers, people whose intentions were hidden, yet whose arrival would tip the balance in ways Cale could not yet predict. The night was alive with threats, with whispered plans, with dangers pressing closer. The canyon no longer felt like refuge, was a stage, and the game had only just begun. Cale's heart beat steadily, but there was an awareness now, sharp and undeniable. Protecting Leora was no longer just about instinct. It was about strategy, about understanding the players who moved in silence around them, about staying one step ahead in a world that measured men by fear and legend rather than truth. Leora felt it too, the weight of unseen eyes, the sense that the night held more than what could be seen. She had come seeking answers, seeking to understand the man behind the monster's name. But the answers would not come easily. Every moment of clarity was punctuated by new uncertainty, every act of courage shadowed by danger. And as she watched Cale move through the darkness, silent and unflinching, she realized that the man she had begun to trust carried secrets that the world might never forgive and enemies who would never relent. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound of hoofbeats and voices from the ridge above. Cale's eyes narrowed. Reinforcements? Or another threat? He could not tell yet. But he knew the truth. The night had only just begun. By sunrise, Red Rock Hollow and perhaps the lands beyond would see whether the man they called a monster truly had the heart to survive, whether anyone would live to witness it. The fire flickered violently as the shadows grew, and Cale's hand rested lightly on the knife. Leora's breath caught in her chest, and for the first time she understood the weight of the legend. This was not a story that ended quickly. This was a story measured in survival, loyalty, and the choices that defined men when the world offered no mercy. And in that moment, the canyon seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, the next revelation, the next strike. Cale Thorne and Leora Vale were not just surviving the night, they were stepping into a conflict that would test everything they knew about courage, trust, and what it truly meant to protect someone when the world refused to see the truth. The canyon felt alive with shadows now, every movement sharper, every sound amplified by the night. Cale Thorne's eyes never wavered, scanning the dark edges where the wind carried distant voices and the faintest footsteps. He could feel the anticipation, the tension tightening like a coiled spring. Leora Vale crouched beside him, her body taut with readiness, her eyes reflecting both fear and determination. She had never known a world like this where survival depended not on law, but on instinct, courage, and split-second decisions. And yet, she trusted him, the man they all called a monster, more than anyone in town. Ryland Cade remained across the canyon, a predator in the shadows. He did not move yet, waiting, calculating, letting the night work in his favor. Cale knew the man's reputation well. A hunter of men who understood patience better than fury, who thrived on anticipation and the fear that preceded confrontation. And Cale also knew that Ryland's patience could end in sudden, ruthless action. The quiet before the storm was never empty. It was full of purpose, of hidden intent. Suddenly, a shout echoed from the ridge, sharp and loud, and the gang that had been trailing them revealed themselves. A dozen men, armed and ready, began to descend with reckless determination. Their eyes sought fear, and for a heartbeat, the canyon seemed to pulse with the weight of expectation. Cale rose, stepping in front of Leora, body coiled like the spring of a trap. His hand rested lightly on the knife, yet his posture radiated a confidence born of survival and skill honed over countless battles. Leora did not flinch. She lifted her father's old rifle, the wood worn smooth from years of use, and took her place beside him. They were an unlikely pair, the monster and the fearless girl, standing against a tide of danger that seemed almost impossible to hold back. And yet, the quiet strength between them carried weight, unspoken but undeniable. The first man reached the firelight, knife raised, but Cale was already there, shadow striking before the attack could land. The clash was sharp, brutal, and silent, a dance of motion that spoke of years spent surviving when every second counted. Leora fired carefully, aiming to slow, to distract, not to kill. She had learned quickly under Cale's presence that survival required precision, not reckless bravado. Ryland moved now, stepping from the shadows with deliberate control. "Enough games," he called, voice carrying over the canyon, sharp and commanding. "Step aside, Thorne. You can't protect her forever." Cale's eyes narrowed, steel meeting steel in his gaze. "I don't protect for forever. Protect for now, for this moment, and for the people who deserve it," he replied, voice low, calm, yet carrying a power that demanded attention. The canyon erupted in motion. Men shouted, knives clashed, and the wind carried the sound of struggle like a warning. Leora ducked behind a boulder, heart pounding, watching Cale move with precision, striking, parrying, and anticipating each attack. The training he had endured over years of survival was evident in every calculated movement. He did not waste energy, he did not hesitate, and he did not falter. Amid the chaos, Cale's mind raced. This was more than a simple attack, it was the culmination of weeks of pursuit. Whispers of vengeance, and the invisible threads of danger that had followed him from settlement to settlement. He knew there was a larger plan at play, one that extended beyond the gang and beyond Ryland Cade. Someone or something wanted to see him broken, to test the legend and expose him as the monster the world believed him to be. And yet, as he fought, he realized that the greater threat was not just physical, it was the potential loss of Leora, the one person who had dared to see beyond his scars, beyond the stories. The fight pressed them closer to the edge of the canyon, where the rocks dropped sharply into shadowed crevices. Cale moved with careful calculation, drawing the attackers into positions where he could control the battle despite being outnumbered. Leora followed instinct, moving with him, covering his blind spots, and proving that bravery was not measured by legend alone. Ryland observed, eyes sharp, calculating each moment, waiting for the perfect opening. "You've grown predictable, Thorn," he called, stepping closer, knife glinting in the firelight. "I know your moves, your instincts, even your hesitation. You can't fight them all forever." Cale paused, hand gripping the knife tighter. He knew Ryland's words carried truth. The night was long, the attackers relentless, and the canyon offered no sanctuary forever. But he also knew the strength of choice, of loyalty, of courage that would not bend even under impossible pressure. The man they called a monster did not fight because he wanted glory or revenge. He fought because it was right, because the innocent depended on him, because some battles were not measured by odds but by heart. Leora saw the tension in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that rarely touched him. She reached out, gripping his arm lightly. "We can do this," she said, voice steady, filled with resolve. Together, Cale nodded slightly, acknowledging her courage. The bond between them, forged in fire and shadow, was stronger than either of them had expected. They were not just defending themselves, they were standing for trust, for loyalty, for the fragile truth that a man could be called a monster yet carry a heart capable of heroic acts. The gang surged again, reckless now, driven by the belief that overwhelming numbers could crush the legend. Cale struck, precise and controlled, and Leora covered him, each shot and parry measured to protect, to survive. The canyon trembled with the sound of struggle, and Cale felt the weight of every movement, every choice. One misstep could send them tumbling into darkness. One lapse could destroy the fragile hope they clung to. Ryland stepped forward, closer now, the space between predator and prey shrinking. "You can't save them all, Thorn," he said, voice low, carrying menace. "And you can't hide behind one girl forever. This ends tonight." Cale's jaw tightened. He understood the challenge. Ryland represented more than one man. It was the embodiment of every judgment, every fear, every label the world had placed on him. Defeating him was not just survival, it was proving that courage, loyalty, and heart could triumph even when the world refused to understand. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying distant sounds of movement, the faint rustle of more men approaching from the canyon's edge. Cale recognized them instantly, reinforcements for the gang, possibly a second wave, or worse, agents of someone who had been watching him for months. The night had become a trap, a test, a moment where every choice mattered, where hesitation meant death. Leora's hands shook slightly on the rifle, but her eyes remained steady. "We can't let them take us," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Not tonight. Not him, not this." Cale's eyes softened for the briefest moment, seeing her resolve mirrored in his own. He had chosen this path, chosen to protect her when the world saw only a monster. And now, the culmination of threats, lies, and danger pressed on them like a storm that would not break. Every heartbeat, every movement carried the weight of survival and the possibility of loss. The attackers moved in a coordinated push, cutting off escape routes, forcing Cale and Leora closer to the canyon's cliff edge. The night seemed to tighten around them, the darkness pressing in like a living thing, and the firelight flickered, throwing ominous shadows across the rocks. Cale knew they were close to the breaking point, where skill alone would not be enough to prevail. He had to rely on instinct, on courage, on the bond they had formed in the firelight. Ryland's eyes gleamed with the certainty of victory. And Cale could sense the climax approaching. the moment where choice and consequence would collide. The canyon held its breath, the wind silenced for just a heartbeat, and every figure, friend, foe, and observer paused in anticipation. The night had become a stage for the ultimate test, proving ground for the man called a monster and the girl who refused to fear him. And then, as the moon broke through the clouds, casting pale light over the canyon, Cale and Leora stood together, back to back, facing the gathering threat. Every instinct, every ounce of skill, every choice made in silence now mattered. The night stretched, full of tension, full of peril, full of unspoken questions. Would they survive? Would the world finally see the truth in Cale's heart? Or would the shadow of legend, fear, and revenge consume them before dawn? The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the sense of what was to come. The attackers advanced, Ryland's gaze fixed and calculating, and Cale felt the weight of every life depending on him. Leora's presence, steady and unwavering, reminded him why he fought, why he survived, why the world had yet to witness the true heart of the man they called a monster. And in that moment, the canyon held its breath, the night waited, and the story teetered on the edge of revelation and chaos. Everything they had endured, every act of courage, every whisper of loyalty, had led to this point, the final confrontation before the dawn, before the truth could be revealed, before the world might finally see the heart behind the legend. The first light of dawn crept over the canyon walls, painting the jagged rocks with pale gold. The night had been long, unforgiving, but Cale Thorne stood still, breathing slowly, letting the tension ebb from his shoulders. Around him, the remnants of the fight lay, scattered men retreating into the shadows, some nursing bruises, others fleeing entirely. The legend of the monster who protected those he cared for had survived the night, and the truth of his heart was no longer a secret to those who mattered. Leora Vale stepped closer, brushing dust from her clothes, her green eyes wide with both relief and awe. You saved us," she said quietly, almost as if speaking would shatter the fragile moment. Her hand hovered near his arm, hesitant yet seeking the reassurance that he was still here, still himself. Still the man who had carried so much without complaint. Cale looked at her, the firelight of the dying embers catching in his eyes. For years, he had moved through the world expecting fear, distrust, and isolation. He had lived as a shadow, a man whose past was whispered about in corners, whose name carried more terror than truth. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself in decades, a quiet certainty that his actions had meaning, that his choices mattered beyond survival. "We survived," he said simply, voice low but steady. "And that's what matters." The wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the scents of the canyon pine, earth, and the faint trace of the distant plains. Cale and Leora turned their gaze toward the horizon, where Red Rock Hollow waited quietly. The town that had feared him, that had whispered his name with dread, would not forget what had happened that night. But perhaps now, fear would turn into something different, respect, understanding, even gratitude. Cale had shown the world that the man they called a monster had a heart capable of courage, loyalty, and protection that no legend could diminish. Ryland Cade had vanished into the shadows as the first attack ended. He had been clever, patient, relentless, but he had not expected Cale's resolve, or the bond between Cale and Leora. Ryland's eyes, sharp and calculating, had seen the truth that night. Cale's strength was more than muscle or skill, it was the heart he carried, the loyalty he demanded of himself, the courage that refused compromise. And for the first time, Ryland understood that some legends were not born of fear, but of choices, of moments where men refused to bend to the cruelty of the world. As the sun climbed higher, casting warmth over the rugged canyon, Leora turned to Cale fully, the tension of the night finally giving way to quiet relief. The town. "They'll talk," she said, voice thoughtful, "but I think they'll see now. They'll see what I saw the truth about you." Cale shook his head slightly, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Let them talk," he said. "Stories are always louder than truth. But you know what matters? And that's enough for me." The journey back to Red Rock Hollow was quiet, almost serene after the storm of the night, though the path through the canyon felt different in the morning light. Rocks that had loomed like threats the night before now seemed like guides, markers that had led them through chaos toward safety. Leora walked beside Cale, silent but steady, her presence a reminder that courage often came from unexpected places, and that trust was a power stronger than fear. When the edge of the town finally appeared, Cale hesitated. The streets were empty, shutters drawn, and the early sun painted long shadows across the dirt. For years he had imagined this moment differently, arriving to anger, suspicion, perhaps even violence. But now there was only quiet observation. Red Rock Hollow had witnessed the impossible. The truth that the man they feared could be their protector, their shield, and their quiet hero. Leora led the way to her family's ranch, where her father, Garrick Vale, waited. The man had been cautious all night, alert to every sound and movement. Yet when he saw Cale approach unharmed, and Leora at his side, a slow nod of acknowledgement passed between them. Garrick had known courage when he saw it, and he had seen enough tonight to understand that Cale Thorne had more than just survival skills. He had a heart that could protect, a mind that could strategize, and a spirit that refused cruelty. Cale dismounted, letting the horse graze while he and Leora stepped onto familiar earth. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of grounding, a quiet that was more than the absence of danger. It was the presence of understanding, of connection, of a world that finally reflected back what he had carried inside all along. The town began to stir as news of the night spread. People watched from a distance, hesitant, unsure how to greet the man they had feared for so long. Some whispered, some nodded, and a few even approached with cautious respect. Cale acknowledged none of it directly. He had no need for accolades or validation. The truth had been shown, and that was enough. Leora stayed by his side, the bond between them unspoken but unbreakable. Together they had survived. Together they had proven that courage and heart could overcome fear and legend. As the sun climbed higher, casting warmth over Red Rock Hollow, Cale finally allowed himself a breath of relief. The threat had passed, but the lesson remained. The world might never fully understand him, but those who mattered did. Leora's eyes, steady and bright, reminded him that trust and loyalty were far stronger than whispers or fear. The choices he had made, the actions he had taken, had defined not just his survival, but the future of someone he cared about deeply. Garrick Vale approached, hand extended. "You've proven yourself tonight," he said, voice rough but sincere. "It's not the monster the town feared, but a man of honor. And for that, I thank you." Cale shook his hand briefly, a simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of unspoken understanding. He had never sought gratitude, yet in this moment it felt like the quiet acknowledgement of everything he had endured and survived. Leora's smile met his, small but filled with warmth, and it was enough to ease the shadows he had carried for decades. The day unfolded with quiet resolution. The townsfolk began to emerge, observing from safe distances, talking quietly among themselves. Rumors of the night's events spread, but this time they were not tales of fear. They were stories of courage, loyalty, and the undeniable proof that Cale Thorne was far more than the legend suggested. He walked through the town without confrontation, shoulders steady, eyes calm, carrying the quiet strength that had seen him through every challenge. Leora stayed close, her presence a reminder that the bonds we choose are as vital as the ones we inherit. Together, they walked the streets of Red Rock Hollow, not as monster and observer, but as allies, as friends, and as witnesses to the power of trust and courage. The world might still whisper, might still judge, but for those who mattered, the truth had been revealed. As evening fell, Cale returned to the canyon, where the quiet stillness had always been a refuge. This time, however, it was different. He was no longer alone. Leora sat beside the fire, waiting, and for the first time, Cale allowed himself to feel a sense of belonging. They spoke little, letting the night embrace them, but every glance, every shared silence, carried meaning. The battles had tested them, the threats had pressed them to the edge, and yet here they were together, unbroken, stronger than before. Cale realized that being called a monster had never truly mattered. What mattered was choice, courage, and the heart we show when the world doubts us. He had chosen to protect, to trust, and to endure, and in that choice, he had found something more than survival. He had found a reason to hope, to connect, and to live beyond the shadows of fear. Leora looked up at him, eyes reflecting the stars beginning to appear. "You're not a monster," she said softly. "You never were. You just needed someone to see it." Cale allowed a faint smile, the first in a long time that felt unburdened by fear or judgment. "And now someone has," he replied, "and maybe that's enough to start changing the rest." The wind whispered through the canyon, soft and gentle, carrying a sense of peace that had eluded them for so long. Cale Thorne, the man who had been feared and misunderstood, now stood in the quiet after the storm, the world watching him in awe, but more importantly, one heart beside him finally understanding the truth. He had survived, he had protected, and he had finally been seen not as a monster but as a man capable of courage, loyalty, and love. The night settled fully over Red Rock Hollow, and for the first time the town could rest, knowing that the darkness had passed and that one man's heart had shone brighter than legend, fear, or shadow. Cale and Leora remained by the fire, their silhouettes bathed in moonlight, a quiet testament to the power of trust, protection, and the undeniable truth that even in a world built on fear, courage, and love could prevail. The canyon held its breath no longer. Peace had returned, tentative but real, and the world at last had seen the heart behind the monster,